Sometimes life hits you when you least expect it, reminding you that even the strongest among us can't control everything. For Mason Dyer, a 34-year-old cowboy who'd spent his life working the harsh Arizona desert, that moment came with two sharp fangs piercing through his leather boot. He thought he knew rattlesnakes. Growing up on the ranch, he'd learned to respect them but never fear them. This bite seemed like any other, painful, dangerous, but manageable. A quick trip to Doc Henderson's clinic for some antivenom, and he'd be back to work. But when the blood work came back, everything changed. The venom wasn't from any snake that lived in their region. It belonged to a species that had been extinct for over a century. What kind of snake carries venom from the past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Dyer ranch, painting the desert landscape in shades of amber and rust. Mason had always found comfort in these early hours, when the world felt honest and uncomplicated. The cattle moved slowly toward the water troughs, their bells creating a familiar symphony that had filled his mornings for as long as he could remember. This ranch had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built the original homestead in 1952, a simple structure that had weathered countless storms and seasons. His father had expanded it, adding the modern barn and upgrading the water systems. Now it was Mason's turn to carry the legacy forward, though he sometimes wondered if he was doing it justice. At 34, Mason looked older than his years. The Arizona sun had carved lines around his eyes and weathered his hands until they resembled the leather reins he worked with daily. His marriage to Jennifer had ended 2 years ago. She'd grown tired of the isolation, the long days, the uncertainty that came with ranch life. She'd moved to Phoenix, seeking the convenience and social life that the desert couldn't provide. Mason understood her choice, even if it had left him questioning his own. There were nights when the silence felt overwhelming, when he wondered if holding on to this land was worth the loneliness. But every sunrise reminded him why his family had chosen this place. The desert had a way of stripping away everything unnecessary, leaving only what truly mattered. The bite had happened near the old Clearwater mine, about 2 miles northeast of the main house. Mason had been checking on a small herd that had wandered toward the abandoned property, drawn by a natural spring that still provided water despite the mine's decades of dormancy. He'd been pulling a stubborn calf away from some rusted equipment when he felt the familiar weight of a snake striking his boot. The pain had been immediate but expected. Living in rattlesnake country meant accepting certain risks. He'd killed the snake with his walking stick, noting its unusual coloration but thinking little of it. The drive to town had been routine 30 minutes on dusty roads he'd traveled since childhood. Doc Henderson's clinic sat on Main Street, a modest building that had served the community for over 40 years. Dr. James Henderson was pushing 70, but showed no signs of retiring. His gray beard and gentle manner had comforted 3 generations of locals through everything from broken bones to difficult births. Mason had always trusted him implicitly. "Let's have a look at this bite," Doc had said, his experienced hands examining the puncture wounds through the torn leather. "Looks like a good-sized rattler got you. When did this happen?" "About an hour ago. Snake was acting strange, though. Didn't rattle before it struck, and the coloring was off. More yellow than I've seen before." Doc had cleaned the wound and drawn blood for testing, explaining the importance of identifying the specific venom to choose the right antivenom. The clinic wasn't equipped for extensive testing, but he maintained relationships with laboratories in Phoenix that could provide quick results. "Should have the results by tomorrow," he'd said, bandaging Mason's leg. "In the meantime, rest up and watch for any unusual symptoms. You know the drill." But the results, when they came, had changed everything. "Mason, I need you to come in immediately." Doc's voice had carried an urgency that Mason had never heard before. There's something about your blood work that doesn't make sense. The drive back to town had felt different somehow, charged with anticipation and unease. Doc had been waiting in his office, a thick leather-bound journal open on his desk alongside printouts of laboratory results. "The venom in your system," Doc began slowly. "It's not from any rattlesnake species currently living in Arizona. According to these tests, it matches samples from a snake that's been extinct for over 100 years. Mason had stared at the papers, trying to make sense of the scientific terminology. "That can't be right. Maybe the lab made a mistake." That's what I thought. So I had them run the tests twice more. Same results every time. Doc had gestured to the journal. "This belonged to a mining camp doctor who worked the Clearwater mine back in the 1880s. I acquired it from an estate sale years ago, thought it might make interesting reading." Dr. Ezra Blackwood documented several snakebite cases involving a species he called Crotalus perditus. "The venom profile matches your blood work exactly." The journal's pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with careful handwriting and detailed sketches. Dr. Blackwood had been meticulous in his observations, noting not just the venom's effects, but also strange behavioral changes in some patients who survived the bites. According to Blackwood's notes, Doc continued, "The survivors experienced enhanced physical capabilities, improved strength, sharper senses, faster healing. But there were side effects. Some became aggressive, others simply disappeared into the desert." The mine closed suddenly in 1887, and the entire Blackwood family vanished overnight. Mason had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "You're saying this snake that bit me has been extinct for over a century, but somehow it's still out there." "I'm saying we need to figure out what's really going on, and I think we need some expert help." That expert had arrived 3 days later. Dr. Sarah Chun was a herpetologist from Arizona State University, specializing in venomous species and their evolutionary history. Doc Henderson had contacted her through professional channels, explaining the unusual case without revealing all the details. Sarah was in her early 30s, with the kind of focused intelligence that Mason associated with people who had spent their lives studying things most people preferred to avoid. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wore field clothes that suggested she was more comfortable outdoors than in laboratories. "Dr. Henderson sent me copies of your blood work," she'd said during their first meeting at the clinic. "I have to admit, I'm skeptical. Crotalus perditus was never definitively proven to exist. Most herpetologists consider it a misidentification of existing species." "Then explain these results," Doc had challenged, handing her the laboratory reports. Sarah had studied the papers carefully, her expression shifting from skepticism to fascination. "If this is accurate, you've encountered something that could rewrite our understanding of southwestern reptile evolution. I need to examine the bite site and collect environmental samples." Mason had agreed to guide her to the location, partly from curiosity and partly because he was beginning to feel changes in himself that he couldn't explain. His vision seemed sharper, especially in low light. His hearing had become more acute, picking up sounds that had always been present but unnoticed. Most unsettling, his strength seemed to be increasing. Tasks that had always required effort now felt effortless. The ranch's oldest employee was Pete Castellanos, a weathered man in his 70s who had worked for Mason's father and grandfather. Old Pete, as everyone called him, knew the history of every rock and ravine within 50 miles. He'd been reluctant to discuss the Clearwater mine, changing the subject whenever it came up in conversation. "Some places are better left alone," he'd finally said when pressed. "The desert keeps its secrets for good reasons." But as Mason's condition continued to change, Pete had begun sharing fragments of stories he'd heard as a young man. Tales of strange lights at the mine, of men who went in ordinary and came out different, of the Blackwood family's sudden departure in the middle of the night. My grandfather worked that mine briefly, Pete had admitted during one of their evening conversations on the ranch house porch. Said the Blackwoods were conducting experiments down in the deeper tunnels, not just mining something else, something they kept secret from the other workers. The town of Clearwater had never fully recovered from the mine's closure. What had once been a thriving community of nearly 1,000 people had dwindled to fewer than 200 residents, most of whom worked the surrounding ranches or commuted to larger towns for employment. The mine itself had been sealed decades ago, declared unsafe due to unstable tunnels and the risk of cave-ins. But Mason was beginning to suspect that safety hadn't been the only reason for sealing the mine. Dr. Sarah Chun had spent her first week in Clearwater, conducting preliminary research, reviewing geological surveys and historical records at the small-town library. She'd found references to the Blackwood family's mining operation, but little detail about their methods or the circumstances of their departure. "It's strange," she'd told Mason during one of their planning meetings. Most mining operations from that era left extensive records, production reports, employee rosters, correspondence with suppliers. The Blackwood mine is almost invisible in the historical record. After 1885, Mason had been experiencing more changes. His sleep patterns had shifted. He found himself naturally waking before dawn and remaining alert well into the evening. His appetite had changed too, craving protein in quantities that seemed excessive. Most dramatically, his physical strength continued to increase. He could now lift feed sacks that would have challenged him before, and his endurance seemed limitless. Doc Henderson had been monitoring his condition through regular blood tests, documenting changes that defied medical explanation. "Your cellular regeneration rate has accelerated significantly," he'd explained. "Cuts heal in hours instead of days. Your muscle density has increased by nearly 20%. Whatever this venom is doing to you, it's rewriting your body's basic operating system." The implications were both thrilling and terrifying. Mason felt more capable than ever before, but he was changing into something he didn't recognize. The man who had been bitten by that snake was becoming someone or something else. As Sarah prepared for their expedition to the mine site, Mason found himself torn between scientific curiosity and a growing sense that some discoveries were too dangerous to pursue. The desert had always been a place of harsh truths, where survival depended on understanding and respecting natural laws. But this felt different, like they were approaching something that existed outside those laws entirely. The night before their planned expedition, Mason had stood on his porch, looking toward the distant hills where the Clearwater mine waited in the darkness. The stars seemed brighter than usual, and he could hear sounds from miles away: coyotes calling, cattle moving, the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. His enhanced senses painted a detailed picture of the world around him, but they also reminded him that he was no longer entirely part of that world. Whatever they found at the mine, Mason suspected it would change everything. The question was whether that change would lead to understanding or something far more dangerous. The snake that had bitten him had been carrying secrets from the past, and those secrets were about to reshape his future in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. The confirmation came on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide Mason's life into before and after. Sarah had spent 3 days at the university laboratory, running every test she could think of, consulting with colleagues and double-checking results that should have been impossible. "There's no question anymore," she announced, spreading printouts across Doc Henderson's desk. "The venom profile matches historical samples of Crotalus perdidus exactly. More than that, I found living cellular components that suggest recent exposure within the last month." Doc Henderson leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses to clean them slowly. It was a habit Mason recognized from childhood, something the old doctor did when processing information that challenged his understanding of the world. "So where dealing with a species that supposedly went extinct over a century ago, but somehow survived in isolation, Doc said finally. The question is where and how. Sarah pulled out a magnifying glass and opened Dr. Blackwood's mining journal to a page Mason hadn't seen before. Tucked between the back cover and the final page was a hand-drawn map, so carefully folded that it had become almost invisible. I found this yesterday while examining the journal more closely, Sarah said, carefully unfolding the brittle paper. Look at these markings. The map showed the Clearwater mine property in remarkable detail, with tunnel systems extending far beyond what appeared in any official mining survey. More intriguing were the symbols scattered throughout the drawing, small serpent shapes marking specific locations, both above and below ground. Mason studied the map, comparing it to his mental picture of the terrain. This symbol here, near what looks like the old equipment shed, that's exactly where I was bitten. And here, Sarah pointed to another serpent marking deeper in the tunnel system. Dr. Blackwood wrote primary breeding chamber 12 specimens observed. If this is accurate, there was an entire population of these snakes living in the mine. Old. Pete had arrived at the clinic while they were examining the map, ostensibly to check on Mason, but clearly curious about their discoveries. When he saw the map spread across the desk, his weathered face went pale. "Where did you find this?" He asked quietly. "Hidden in Dr. Blackwood's journal," Sarah replied. "Do you recognize it?" Pete was silent for a long moment, staring at the detailed drawings. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of secrets held too long. "My grandfather mentioned a map like this. Said the Blackwoods were obsessed with those tunnels, spent more time exploring than mining. The other workers started getting nervous when men would go down for surveys and come back different." "Different how?" Mason asked. "Stronger, faster, but also stranger. Less human, if that makes sense. Some stopped coming to town, stopped talking to their families. The smart workers quit and left. The others just disappeared one night along with the whole Blackwood family." Sarah's scientific excitement was palpable, but Mason felt a growing unease. His own changes were accelerating. Yesterday he'd accidentally crushed a coffee mug in his grip, and this morning he'd noticed that. His reflection in the mirror looked somehow sharper, as if his features were becoming more defined. "We need to explore those tunnels," Sarah said. "If there's a breeding population of extinct snakes down there, it's the discovery of the century. And if there's something else down there," Pete said quietly, "it might be the last discovery any of us make." Mason made the decision that would change everything. "We'll go tomorrow. But we go prepared, and we go together." That evening, as Mason was checking on his cattle one final time before the expedition, he noticed his truck sitting crooked in the driveway. Upon closer inspection, he discovered that all 4 tires had been slash-cleaned deliberate cuts that had drained them completely. There were no other signs of vandalism, no broken windows or damaged equipment. Just the tires, slashed with surgical precision. The message was clear. Someone knew about their plans and wanted them stopped. Mason called Sarah and Doc Henderson, reporting the incident. They agreed to meet early at the clinic to discuss security concerns. As he hung up the phone, Mason realized he wasn't feeling the fear or anger he would have expected. Instead, he felt a cold, analytical calm that seemed to come from somewhere outside his normal personality. Walking around his property, Mason found himself automatically cataloging potential threats, identifying sightlines and defensive positions. These weren't thoughts that would have occurred to him a month ago, but now they seemed natural, instinctive. Whatever the snake venom was doing to his body, it was also affecting his mind in ways that were both useful and deeply unsettling. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Frank Garrison drove up to the clinic just as Mason, Sarah, and Doc Henderson were loading equipment into Doc's 4-wheel drive vehicle. Garrison was a land developer from Phoenix, A man in his 50s who dressed too well for the desert and spoke with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Morning, folks," Garrison said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I heard through the grapevine that you've been exploring some of the old mining properties around here." "Just some scientific research," Sarah replied carefully. "Nothing that should concern anyone." "Oh, but it does concern me," Garrison continued, his tone remaining pleasant but carrying an undertone of threat. "I've been acquiring mineral rights in this area for several years now. The Clearwater Mine property is part of a larger development project I'm planning." Mason stepped forward, his enhanced senses picking up subtle signs of deception in Garrison's body language. Micro-expressions that suggested this conversation was more important than it appeared. "The mine's been sealed for decades," Mason said. "Nothing but old tunnels and unstable rock." "That's what everyone assumes," Garrison replied. "But modern technology might reveal opportunities that weren't apparent to previous generations. I'd hate for amateur exploration to compromise the site's integrity." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Garrison alternating between veiled threats and seemingly generous offers to fund their research through his development company. Throughout the exchange, Mason found himself studying Garrison with an intensity that felt almost predatory. He could hear the man's heartbeat, smell his nervousness, detect the lies beneath his polished presentation. When Garrison finally left, promising to stay in touch about their activities, Sarah turned to Mason with concern. "That wasn't a casual encounter," she said. "He knows exactly what we're looking for." Doc Henderson nodded grimly. "And he doesn't want us to find it." As they drove toward the mine site, Mason reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. The bite, that had seemed like a simple occupational hazard, had opened a door to mysteries that stretched back over a century. Now, with his enhanced abilities growing stronger each day, he was about to confront whatever secrets lay buried in the Clearwater Mine. The desert landscape passed by the truck windows, familiar terrain that had shaped his entire life. But Mason was seeing it differently now, noticing details that had always been there but never registered. Rock formations that could provide cover, water sources that weren't marked on any map, animal trails that revealed the hidden movements of desert. Life. Sarah was reviewing her equipment one final time, checking cameras, sample containers, and measurement devices. Her scientific enthusiasm hadn't dimmed despite the morning's threats, but Mason could see the concern in her eyes. They were venturing into something that might be far more dangerous than academic research. As the Clearwater Mine came into view, Mason felt a strange sense of homecoming, as if he were returning to a place he'd never actually left. The sensation was unsettling, a reminder that the snake venom was changing more than just his physical capabilities. Whatever they found in those tunnels, Mason suspected it would provide answers to questions he was only beginning to understand. The map had shown them where to look, but it couldn't prepare them for what they might discover about the true nature of the Clearwater Mine and the family that had vanished into the desert over a century ago. The entrance to the Clearwater Mine had been sealed with concrete and steel, but time and desert weather had created gaps large enough for determined exploration. Sarah squeezed through first, her scientific equipment secured in a waterproof backpack. Mason followed, his enhanced strength making the passage easier than it should have been. The air inside was cool and stale, carrying scents of mineral deposits and something else, something organic and unfamiliar that made Mason's enhanced senses react with both attraction and wariness. Doc Henderson brought up the rear, moving carefully but with the determination of a man who had spent decades confronting medical mysteries. "The tunnel structure matches the map exactly," Sarah observed, consulting both Dr. Blackwood's drawing and her modern geological survey equipment. "But look at this." She was pointing to a section of tunnel wall where the natural rock had been carefully modified. Unlike the rough blasting techniques typical of 19th century mining, This work showed precision and attention to detail that suggested purposes beyond ore extraction. Mason ran his hands along the smooth stone, his enhanced tactile sensitivity revealing tool marks and techniques that seemed almost artistic in their execution. This wasn't done for mining. Someone spent a lot of time creating specific spaces down here. They moved deeper into the tunnel system, their LED flashlights, revealing a network of passages that extended far beyond what appeared on any official survey. The deeper they went, the more apparent it became that the Clearwater mine had been designed as much for exploration as excavation. "Here," Doc Henderson called from a side passage. "There's something embedded in the rock." The object was a surveyor's transit, an antique brass instrument used for precise measurements in construction and mapping. Despite being underground for over a century, it remained functional, its lenses clear and its mechanical components still operating smoothly. Sarah examined the instrument with growing excitement. "This is museum quality, and it's been maintained. Look at these adjustment marks. Someone was using this recently." Mason lifted the transit easily, his enhanced strength making the heavy brass instrument feel weightless. As he manipulated the focusing mechanisms, he realized he could see farther into the darkness than should have been possible, even with their artificial lighting. "There's more tunnel ahead," he said, pointing into what appeared to be impenetrable blackness. "Maybe another quarter-mile." "You can see that far?" Sarah asked, studying his face in the flashlight beam. Mason paused, realizing he'd revealed more about his changing condition than intended. "My night vision has been improving. Side effect of the venom, I think." They continued exploring, documenting their findings with photographs and measurements. The tunnel system was vast, far more extensive than any mining operation would require. More puzzling were the chambers they discovered, rooms carved from solid rock with purposes that weren't immediately apparent. It was in the third chamber that Sarah made her breakthrough discovery. "Oh my God," she whispered, her flashlight illuminating a section of tunnel wall that had been modified into what appeared to be a series of habitat terrariums. "They're still here, behind carefully constructed barriers of rock and glass." Sarah's light revealed the unmistakable form of snakes, but unlike any rattlesnake species Mason had ever seen. These creatures were larger, their coloration more vibrant, and their behavior more alert and intelligent than typical desert serpents. "Crotalus perdidus," Sarah breathed. "A living population maintained for over a century." The snakes seemed aware of their presence, watching with an intelligence that made Mason's skin crawl. These weren't ordinary reptiles. There was something in their gaze that suggested awareness, perhaps even recognition. As Sarah worked to document the discovery, Mason found himself drawn to examine the habitat construction. The barriers weren't just functional. They were designed with an understanding of snake behavior that went far beyond 19th century knowledge. Temperature control, humidity regulation, feeding mechanisms, all crafted with scientific precision that seemed impossibly advanced for the era. "Someone's been maintaining this," Doc Henderson observed, examining fresh water sources and recently cleaned glass barriers. "This isn't a century-old installation. It's an active breeding facility." The implications were staggering. Not only had the supposedly extinct snake species survived, but someone had been deliberately preserving and breeding them in the abandoned mine. The question was who and why. As they prepared to leave the breeding chamber, Mason noticed movement in his peripheral vision. A figure was watching them from the tunnel entrance, someone who had followed them into the mine and now blocked their exit. Frank Garrison stepped into the light, no longer maintaining his polished businessman facade. His expression was cold, calculating, and somehow familiar in ways that made Mason's enhanced senses react with immediate alarm. "I did ask you to stay away from here," Garrison said quietly. "But I suppose some discoveries can't be avoided indefinitely." "You're behind this," Sarah stated, her scientific curiosity warring with growing fear. You've been maintaining these specimens. My family has been maintaining them, Garrison corrected. For 4 generations, we've protected this resource, waiting for the right opportunity to unlock its potential. Mason found himself moving without conscious thought, positioning himself between Garrison and his companions. His enhanced reflexes were responding to threat signals he wasn't even consciously processing. The Blackwood family didn't disappear, Mason realized. They changed their name. Very good, Garrison smiled, the expression holding no warmth. Frank Garrison is considerably more marketable than Franklin Blackwood, especially when dealing with investors who might be concerned about certain historical associations. Doc Henderson stepped forward, his medical training overriding his caution. What did you do to Mason? What's that venom really designed for? The venom is exactly what Dr. Blackwood documented in his journal, a biological enhancement agent that improves human physical and mental capabilities. My great-great-grandfather spent decades perfecting the extraction and concentration process. Sarah's equipment began recording automatically, documenting confessions that could reshape understanding of human enhancement research. You've been conducting human experiments for over a century. Selective experiments, Garrison corrected. Finding the right subjects, those genetically compatible with the enhancement process. Mason's family has been under observation for 3 generations. The revelation hit Mason like a physical blow. His grandfather, his father, his own life, all monitored, evaluated, selected for characteristics that would make him suitable for biological modification. The snakebite hadn't been an accident. It had been the culmination of a century-long breeding program. Old Pete, Mason said, pieces falling into place. He's been watching me for you. Pete Castellanos has been a loyal employee of the Blackwood family since he was a young man. His reports on your physical development, your isolation, your genetic markers all indicated you were ready for the enhancement process. As Garrison spoke, Mason's enhanced hearing detected movement in the tunnels behind them. They weren't alone in the mine, and whatever was approaching carried the sound, signature of multiple individuals moving with military precision. The scientific expedition had become something far more dangerous, and Mason realized that his transformation was only the beginning of a plan that stretched back over a century and forward into a future he was only beginning to understand. The footsteps Mason had detected belonged to 3 men in tactical gear, moving through the tunnels with the efficiency of a military unit. Garrison gestured for them to remain in position while he continued his explanation, clearly confident that his guests had no means of escape. The breeding program has produced remarkable results over the decades, Garrison said, examining Sarah's equipment with casual interest. But documentation has always been challenging. Your arrival, Dr. Chun, provided the perfect opportunity to create scientific legitimacy for our work. Sarah's face revealed her growing understanding of how completely she'd been manipulated. Your research foundation, it doesn't exist, does it? Oh, it exists. But its funding comes from sources that will be very interested in human enhancement technologies. Military applications, primarily, though there are commercial possibilities as well. Mason's enhanced senses were processing information at an accelerated rate. The tactical team's positioning, their weapons, the acoustic properties of the tunnel system, all factors in what was rapidly becoming a survival situation. More disturbing were the changes he was experiencing moment by moment. His vision was shifting, allowing him to see clearly in areas where even strong flashlights provided only minimal illumination. The enhancement process typically takes several weeks to reach full effectiveness, Garrison continued, as if conducting a laboratory presentation. But Mason's progress has been exceptional. Would you describe your current capabilities, Mr. Dyer? Mason remained silent, but Doc Henderson stepped forward with medical authority. Whatever you're doing to him, it needs to be reversed. Human biology isn't designed for these kinds of modifications. Human biology isn't designed for many things we consider normal today: anesthesia, organ transplants, genetic therapy. Progress requires pushing boundaries. Garrison pulled out a small device and began taking readings from Mason's direction. Heart rate elevated but steady. Metabolic changes consistent with enhanced physical performance. Sensory modifications proceeding on schedule. The device beeped softly, and Garrison's expression shifted to one of genuine surprise. Interesting. Your adaptation rate is significantly faster than projected. Most subjects require controlled exposure over months. You've achieved similar results in weeks. Sarah had been quietly positioning her equipment to continue recording, but one of the tactical team members moved to confiscate her cameras. As he reached for her backpack, Mason's enhanced reflexes took over. He moved faster than should have been humanly possible, intercepting the tactical operator and disarming him in a motion that felt as natural as breathing. The man's weapon clattered across the tunnel floor while he landed hard against the rock wall, clearly stunned by the speed and strength of Mason's response. Remarkable, Garrison observed, making notes on a handheld device. Combat reflexes. Without combat training, the enhancement is developing beyond our most optimistic projections. The remaining tactical team members raised their weapons, but Mason found himself analyzing their positions and movement patterns with cold, tactical precision. Information was flowing through his consciousness: angles of attack, defensive positions, probability calculations, as if he'd been trained in combat strategy his entire life. "Lower your weapons," Garrison commanded. "Mr. Dyer isn't a threat to us. He's our greatest success." Mason helped Sarah to her feet, noting that his movements felt effortless despite carrying her full weight plus equipment. His strength had increased dramatically, but more troubling was his growing emotional detachment. The fear and confusion he'd felt earlier were being replaced by analytical calm that felt alien to his normal personality. "What's happening to my mind?" Mason asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "The enhancement affects neurological development, as well as physical capabilities. Improved pattern recognition, faster information processing, reduced emotional interference with decision-making. Dr. Blackwood documented similar changes in his successful subjects." Doc Henderson was studying Mason with medical concern. "The successful subjects, what happened to the unsuccessful ones?" "The compatibility rate is approximately 15%, Garrison replied matter-of-factly. "Incompatible subjects experience organ failure within hours of exposure." Mason's survival indicated genetic compatibility, but his rate of adaptation suggests something more significant. As they spoke, Mason discovered something that made his blood chill. Tucked behind one of the snake habitats was a photograph, old and faded but still recognizable. It showed a family group: parents, children, and an older gentleman who could only be the original Dr. Blackwood. But one of the younger men in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to someone Mason knew well. "Pete," Mason said quietly, showing the photograph to his companions. The resemblance was unmistakable. The man in the 19th century photograph could have been old Pete's twin, down to the same weathered features and distinctive jawline. But the photograph was over 130 years old. Pedro Castellanos was one of Dr. Blackwood's first successful subjects, Garrison explained, noting Mason's discovery. "The enhancement process significantly extends human lifespan under optimal conditions. Pete has been working for my family since 1889. The revelation shattered Mason's understanding of his own life history. Pete hadn't just been his family's employee. He'd been monitoring them for over a century, reporting on 3 generations of genetic development, waiting for the right candidate for biological modification. Sarah was examining the photograph with scientific fascination mixed with horror. 136 years old, she whispered. "The cellular regeneration must be incredible. The enhancement rebuilds human biology from the cellular level. Garrison confirmed. Extended lifespan, immunity to most diseases, physical capabilities that far exceed normal human ranges. The few subjects who survive the initial process become something approaching superhuman. Mason found himself studying his own hands, noting changes in muscle definition and skin texture that hadn't been apparent hours earlier. The transformation was accelerating, but each improvement came with psychological changes that made him question his own identity. "How many others are there?" Doc Henderson asked. "How many enhanced subjects? Currently active?" "Including Mason, perhaps a dozen worldwide. The process is difficult, and suitable candidates are rare. But the results justify the challenges." Garrison gestured to his tactical team. "These men represent more conventional enhancement methods, surgical modification, pharmaceutical augmentation, technological integration. Effective, but limited compared to biological transformation." The growing romantic tension between Mason and Sarah had been building over their weeks of collaboration. But now Mason wondered if his feelings were genuine or simply another aspect of his changing psychology. Enhanced subjects might experience altered emotional responses, modified social behavior, adjusted priorities that served the enhancement rather than the individual dot, as if reading his thoughts. Garrison smiled. Personal relationships become complicated during the transition period. Enhanced subjects often find themselves drawn to others who share their modified biology. "Dr. Chen, your presence here serves multiple purposes." Sarah stepped back instinctively, understanding the implication. "You're planning to enhance me as well." The process works more effectively when subjects have social bonds to maintain psychological stability during the transition. Mason's attachment to you provides emotional anchoring that improves survival odds for both subjects. Mason felt a surge of protective fury that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his normal emotional responses. The enhancement was changing his psychology, but it was also amplifying certain feelings, including his growing attachment to Sarah and his determination to protect her from Garrison's experiments. The tactical team was repositioning, clearly, preparing to escort them deeper into the mine complex. But Mason's enhanced senses were detecting something else, vibrations through the rock that suggested structural instability in the tunnel system ahead. The Clearwater mine was more dangerous than anyone realized, and they were all walking into a trap that had been over a century in the making. The research facility's lower levels contained archives that chronicled over a century of human enhancement experiments. Elena Vasquez had been studying these records for months before Mason's enhancement began, though she'd introduced herself to the team under very different circumstances. Dr. Vasquez isn't actually a historical researcher, Garrison announced as they entered a climate-controlled archive room. She's a federal agent investigating a series of missing persons cases across the Southwest. Cases that all trace back to our recruitment efforts. Elena stepped out of the shadows, her academic facade replaced by the bearing of someone trained in law enforcement. Her expression carried professional determination mixed with personal regret as she faced Mason and his companions. "I've been tracking enhanced subjects for 3 years," she said quietly. 27 people have disappeared after exhibiting unusual physical capabilities. All were traced to contact with Blackwood Research Foundation activities. Sarah turned to face Elena with a mixture of betrayal and understanding. "You've been investigating us from the beginning." "I've been trying to prevent what's happening here," Elena replied. "But my cover was compromised when I started getting too close to the truth about the enhancement process." Garrison gestured to wall-mounted displays that contained documentation spanning decades of research. Chemical formulas, genetic analysis, psychological profiles, and clinical notes painted a comprehensive picture of systematic human experimentation conducted with scientific rigor and complete disregard for human rights. Dr. Elena Vasquez, FBI Special Agent assigned to Unusual Crimes Investigation. Garrison read from a file folder. Doctorate in Biochemistry, specialized training in biological weapons identification, and unfortunately for her, exceptional genetic compatibility with our enhancement protocols. Mason was studying the archived documents with enhanced cognitive capabilities that allowed him to process information at accelerated rates. The research showed clear patterns. Subjects were selected based on genetic markers, isolated from normal social support systems, and then exposed to increasingly concentrated venom preparations until they either died or transformed. The psychological conditioning is as important as the biological modification, Mason observed, his analytical detachment allowing him to study his own situation with clinical objectivity. Enhanced subjects are systematically separated from human connections to prevent resistance to the transformation. Very good, Garrison approved. Enhanced subjects who maintain strong human relationships often reject their new capabilities, leading to psychological instability and eventual suicide. Isolation ensures full acceptance of the enhanced state. Doc Henderson was examining medical records that detailed the enhancement process from a clinical perspective. The cellular modification is incredible, he admitted despite his moral objections. Regenerative capabilities that essentially eliminate aging, immune system enhancement that prevents disease, physical modifications that triple normal human strength and speed. And the cost? Sarah asked, though Mason suspected she already understood the answer. Alina pulled out a thick folder containing psychological evaluations of successful enhancement. Subjects. Complete personality reconstruction. Enhanced subjects lose empathy, emotional connection, moral reasoning, everything that makes them recognizably human. They become highly intelligent, physically capable sociopaths. Mason felt a chill of recognition as he examined his own changing thought patterns. The emotional detachment he'd been experiencing, the analytical approach to human relationships, the growing sense that normal human concerns were somehow beneath him, all symptoms of the psychological modification. Elena described. The enhancement rebuilds the subject's value system, Garrison explained. Normal human emotions become obstacles to optimal performance. Enhanced subjects develop new priorities based on efficiency, survival, and advancement, rather than connection, compassion, or community. Sarah was studying Mason with growing concern, clearly recognizing changes in his behavior and responses. How much time do we have before the transformation becomes irreversible? The psychological changes typically stabilize within 6 to 8 weeks of initial exposure, Elena replied. But Mason's transformation is proceeding faster than normal. He may have days rather than weeks before the modification becomes permanent. The archive room contained one display that drew Mason's attention with disturbing intensity. It showed photographs of successful enhancement subjects across multiple decades, documenting their transformation from normal humans to something that looked human but clearly wasn't. The earliest photographs showed Dr. Blackwood himself, documented at various stages of his own enhancement process. Later images revealed Pete Castellanos, confirming his century-plus lifespan and showing his gradual transformation from normal ranch hand to something more predatory and calculating. But the most recent photographs showed subjects Mason recognized people from nearby communities who had disappeared over the past decade, now revealed as enhanced beings working within Garrison's organization. The tactical team isn't military, Mason realized. They're enhanced subjects like me. Enhanced subjects make ideal operatives, Garrison confirmed. Superior physical capabilities, reduced emotional interference, absolute loyalty to the enhancement program. They understand that their survival depends on the continued success of our research. Elena moved closer to Mason, her federal training evident in her assessment of tactical situations. The enhanced subjects aren't just physically modified. They're psychologically programmed to protect the research at any cost, including eliminating anyone who threatens the program. As if responding to Elena's warning, the tactical team adjusted. their positions no longer maintaining the pretense of escort duty. Their weapons remained lowered, but their body language suggested readiness for immediate violence if circumstances required it. Mason's enhanced senses detected subtle changes in their positioning that revealed military-level coordination and tactical awareness. These weren't hired security personnel. They were highly trained operatives who had been enhanced beyond normal human capabilities and psychologically conditioned for absolute obedience. The choice you're facing, Mason, isn't just personal, Elena continued. Enhanced subjects become part of a collective dedicated to expanding the enhancement program. Your individual desires become subordinate to the group's objectives. Sarah was examining chemical formulas that detailed the venom concentration process, her scientific background allowing her to understand the biological mechanisms involved. The enhancement is irreversible, she said quietly. Once the cellular modification reaches critical mass, there's no way to restore normal human biology. But there might be a way to prevent completion of the process, Doc Henderson observed, studying medical records with professional interest. The transformation requires specific chemical triggers to achieve full modification. Without those triggers, the enhancement might stabilize in an intermediate state. Garrison's expression shifted to one of genuine concern. Incomplete enhancement is worse than failure. Subjects who don't achieve full modification experience progressive cellular breakdown and psychological disintegration. It's a prolonged, agonizing death. Mason found himself analyzing the conversation with enhanced cognitive capabilities that felt increasingly alien to his normal thought patterns. The logical conclusion was clear. He could complete the enhancement and become something beyond human, attempt reversal, and likely die in the process, or try to stabilize at an intermediate level with unknown consequences. But his enhanced intellect was also detecting patterns in the archived research that suggested a fourth option, one that none of the previous enhancement subjects had considered because they lacked the specific combination of genetic compatibility, rapid adaptation rate, and social connections that Mason possessed. The warning in Dr. Blackwood's locket had mentioned choice, but Mason was beginning to understand that the real choice wasn't between enhancement and humanity. It was between accepting the Blackwood legacy and creating something entirely new. As the tactical team prepared to escort them to the final phase of the research facility, Mason realized that his enhanced capabilities weren't just physical and mental. They were giving him the ability to see possibilities that had been invisible to previous generations of test subjects. The question was whether he could act on those possibilities before the psychological modification eliminated his motivation to remain human. The final level of the Clearwater Mine complex revealed a laboratory that surpassed anything Mason could have imagined. Hidden beneath generations of secrecy was a research facility that rivaled modern university installations, complete with specimen preservation systems, genetic analysis equipment, and surgical suites that looked more like something from a science fiction film than a 19th century mining operation. But the most shocking discovery wasn't the advanced technology. It was the scope of the operation and the true identity of its architects. "Welcome to the primary research facility," Garrison announced, gesturing to banks of computers and monitoring equipment that hummed with quiet efficiency. Dr. Blackwood's original laboratory, continuously upgraded and expanded for over 130 years. The walls were lined with preservation tanks containing specimens that represented decades of enhancement research. But unlike the snake habitats they'd seen earlier, these tanks contained human subjects in various stages of transformation, some clearly successful, others frozen at the moment of enhancement failure. "My God," Sarah whispered, her scientific fascination overwhelmed by the horror of what she was seeing. "You've been conducting human experiments for over a century." "We've been advancing human evolution," Garrison corrected. "Each generation building upon the successes and failures of previous research." The enhancement process you're witnessing represents the cumulative knowledge of 4 generations of dedicated scientists. Mason's enhanced senses were processing information faster than his consciousness could fully comprehend. The laboratory's design, the equipment placement, the research methodologies all suggested a level of scientific sophistication that seemed impossible for any individual family to maintain across multiple generations. Elena was examining computer displays that showed current research projects spanning multiple locations across the American Southwest. This isn't just the Clearwater Mine, she realized. You're operating research facilities across 6 states. The Blackwood Research Foundation maintains 17 active facilities, Garrison confirmed, each one conducting different aspects of enhancement research, testing various applications of the core biological modification process. Doc Henderson was studying medical records that documented enhancement procedures performed on hundreds of subjects over the past century. The success rate has improved dramatically in recent decades, he observed. Early experiments had survival rates below 10%. Current procedures show success rates approaching 40%. Improved understanding of genetic compatibility, better venom concentration techniques, and enhanced psychological preparation protocols, Garrison explained. Each failed subject provided data that improved outcomes for subsequent experiments. Mason found himself drawn to a section of the laboratory that contained what appeared to be historical exhibits, displays showing the evolution of enhancement research from Dr. Blackwood's crude 19th century experiments to the sophisticated procedures being conducted today. But as he examined the historical progression, Mason began to notice inconsistencies that his enhanced analytical capabilities flagged as significant anomalies. The research methodologies are too advanced, Mason said slowly. His enhanced intellect processing patterns that didn't match the supposed timeline. 19th century scientists didn't have the knowledge base to develop these enhancement protocols. Sarah joined him in examining the historical displays, her academic background allowing her to identify specific scientific advances that shouldn't have been available to Dr. Blackwood's generation. Genetic analysis, cellular modification techniques, neurological conditioning. None of this was possible until at least the 1950s. Garrison's expression shifted subtly, revealing satisfaction rather than concern at their growing understanding. Very good. Enhanced subjects do develop superior pattern recognition capabilities. Elena stepped forward with the bearing of someone trained to detect deception. The Blackwood family didn't develop this technology. You acquired it from somewhere else. We didn't acquire it, Garrison smiled. We've been developing it for much longer than you realize. He led them to a sealed chamber at the center of the laboratory complex, using biometric scanners that recognized his genetic markers to unlock multiple security systems. Beyond the reinforced doors lay a room that defied every assumption they'd made about the research program. The chamber contained equipment that was clearly beyond current human technological capabilities, devices that seemed to operate on principles of physics that Mason's enhanced intellect could recognize but not fully comprehend. But more disturbing were the occupants of the chamber. Figures moved in the shadows, their silhouettes suggesting human form but with proportions and movements that indicated significant biological modification. As they stepped into the light, Mason saw beings that retained human features but had been enhanced far beyond anything he'd witnessed in the previous laboratories. Meet the true architects of the enhancement program, Garrison announced. The beings who provided the original research and have been guiding human modification research for over 2 centuries. The enhanced beings regarded Mason and his companions with intelligence that felt ancient and utterly alien despite their recognizably human origins. Their eyes held depths of knowledge and experience that suggested lifespans measured in centuries rather than decades. Enhanced humans aren't the end goal of the research, one of the beings spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies Mason's improved hearing could detect, but his normal ears shouldn't have been able to process. They're an intermediate step in a longer evolutionary process. Sarah's scientific worldview was reeling as she attempted to process the implications. "You're not from Earth." "We're from Earth," the being corrected, "but from a version of Earth's evolutionary timeline that diverged from your development several millennia ago. The enhancement process is designed to bridge that evolutionary gap." Elena's federal training was struggling to categorize what she was witnessing. Interdimensional contact. That's why you could never find the source of the technology. It doesn't exist in our normal reality. Mason felt his enhanced consciousness expanding to accommodate concepts that his normal human intellect couldn't have grasped. The beings weren't alien invaders. They were humans from an alternate evolutionary path, one where biological enhancement had become the foundation of civilization rather than technological development. The snake venom is just the delivery mechanism, Mason realized. The real enhancement comes from genetic material that originated in a parallel evolutionary timeline. Very good, Garrison approved. The interdimensional contact was established in 1847 when Dr. Blackwood's mining operations accidentally breached a dimensional barrier deep beneath the Clearwater property. The beings you see provided the original enhancement, technology in exchange for the opportunity to study our reality's evolutionary development. Doc Henderson's medical understanding was struggling to process the biological implications. Cross-dimensional genetic modification. You're essentially creating hybrid beings that combine evolutionary traits from parallel human development. The ultimate goal is convergence, the enhanced being explained. Both evolutionary timelines benefit from genetic exchange. Your reality gains enhanced biological capabilities, while our timeline gains exposure to your technological development approaches. Sarah was examining equipment that operated on principles beyond her scientific understanding, but her enhanced pattern recognition was beginning to identify underlying logical structures. "How many realities are you in contact with?" 47 human evolutionary timelines have been identified, Garrison replied. The enhancement program you're experiencing represents techniques developed across multiple dimensional variants of human civilization. The revelation recontextualized everything Mason thought he understood about his situation. The enhancement wasn't just biological modification. It was the first step in becoming something that transcended normal human evolutionary limitations. Enhanced subjects serve as bridges between realities, the being continued. Your enhanced capabilities allow you to perceive and interact with dimensional variations that normal humans cannot access. Mason's consciousness was expanding to accommodate awareness that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. He could sense presence beyond normal three-dimensional space, perceive possibilities that existed in parallel probability streams, understand concepts that his normal human intellect would have found incomprehensible. But with enhanced awareness came the understanding that the choice he faced wasn't just personal. It would determine humanity's evolutionary future and Earth's relationship with parallel versions of human civilization. Elena stepped forward with determination that transcended her fear. What happens to normal humans if the enhancement program succeeds? Normal humans become obsolete, the being replied without emotion. Enhanced subjects represent the next stage of human evolution. Traditional human biology becomes an evolutionary dead end. Mason felt the full weight of the choice he was facing. Accept the enhancement and become part of a species that would replace normal humanity, or resist and likely die in the process. But his enhanced consciousness was also detecting possibilities that neither Garrison nor the interdimensional beings had considered. The enhancement process was designed for individual transformation, but Mason's unique combination of rapid adaptation and social connections, might allow for something unprecedented group enhancement that preserved human emotional connections while gaining enhanced capabilities. As the interdimensional beings prepared to begin the final phase of his transformation, Mason realized that the true choice wasn't between enhancement and humanity. It was between accepting their vision of human evolution and creating an entirely new path forward. Mason's enhanced consciousness was processing multiple reality streams simultaneously, allowing him to perceive possibilities that existed beyond normal three-dimensional space. But with this expanded awareness came the understanding that time was running out, not just for his own transformation, but for the future of human evolution itself. The interdimensional beings had begun preparing enhancement procedures for Sarah and Elena, their movements sufficient and emotionless as they configured equipment that operated on principles beyond conventional physics. But Mason's enhanced pattern recognition was detecting flaws in their methodology, assumptions about human psychology and social bonding that their own evolutionary path had eliminated from their understanding. The individual enhancement protocol has fundamental weaknesses, Mason said, his enhanced intellect allowing him to communicate concepts that his normal consciousness couldn't have articulated. Enhanced subjects who lose emotional connections become psychologically unstable, ultimately limiting their effectiveness. The lead being paused in its preparations, regarding Mason with interest that seemed genuine rather than merely clinical. Explain your analysis. Mason's enhanced consciousness was simultaneously processing his own psychological changes, observing the behavioral patterns of the enhanced tactical team, and analyzing historical data from over a century of enhancement research. The synthesis revealed patterns that even the interdimensional beings hadn't fully recognized. Enhanced subjects without social bonds lack psychological anchoring, Mason continued. They become capable but ultimately purposeless, leading to self-destructive behavior that limits their contribution to evolutionary advancement. The enhancement process needs to preserve rather than eliminate emotional connections. Sarah was listening with growing understanding, her scientific background allowing her to follow Mason's reasoning despite the otherworldly context. Group enhancement, she realized. Preserving social structures during the transformation process. No. Previous subject has maintained sufficient cognitive coherence during enhancement to propose alternative methodologies. The being acknowledged. Your adaptation rate is unprecedented. Elena had been quietly observing the interdimensional being's technology. Her federal training focused on identifying potential weaknesses in their operational security. They're not infallible, she said quietly to Doc Henderson. The dimensional bridging requires enormous energy expenditure. The equipment is sophisticated, but also fragile. Doc Henderson was studying the enhancement preparation procedures from a medical perspective, noting details that might be relevant to developing countermeasures. The final transformation requires precise timing and chemical balance. Disruption at the right moment might reverse the process, but Mason's enhanced senses detected conversations taking place throughout the complex enhanced subjects, coordinating a response to what they perceived as resistance to the enhancement program. The tactical team was preparing for the possibility that Mason's group might attempt to disrupt the research. We have perhaps 30 minutes before they implement full security protocols, Mason warned his companions. After that, escape becomes impossible. Garrison was monitoring the enhancement preparation with scientific fascination, taking detailed notes on Mason's unprecedented psychological coherence during advanced transformation. The enhancement is proceeding beyond our most optimistic projections, he told the interdimensional beings. Mason's maintained emotional connections may represent a breakthrough in our understanding of successful enhancement psychology. The lead being was studying Mason with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Your proposal for group enhancement. Describe the methodology you envision. Mason's enhanced consciousness was formulating concepts in real time, drawing from enhanced pattern recognition, accelerated learning capabilities, and intuitive understanding of biological systems that transcended normal human knowledge. Simultaneous enhancement of emotionally bonded subjects, maintaining psychological connections throughout the transformation process. Enhanced capabilities without loss of human empathy and social bonding. Theoretically possible. The being. Acknowledged, but never attempted due to exponentially increased complexity and risk of total failure. Sarah stepped forward, her scientific training overriding her fear as she recognized the historical significance of what Mason was proposing. If it works, you create enhanced humans who retain emotional intelligence and social cooperation. If it fails, you lose multiple potential subjects simultaneously. The risk-benefit analysis favors individual enhancement protocols, Garrison interjected. Established procedures with documented success rates versus experimental approaches with unknown variables. But Mason's enhanced senses were detecting something that changed his entire assessment of the situation. Throughout the complex, he could hear enhanced subjects coordinating activities that suggested the research program was preparing for much more than individual transformations. This isn't about researching enhancement techniques, Mason realized. You're preparing for a large-scale implementation. The interdimensional beings exchanged communication in frequencies that Mason's enhanced hearing could detect but not fully interpret. When they responded, their explanation revealed the true scope of their plans. Enhanced individual subjects have been establishing positions throughout human civilization for decades, the lead being confirmed. Government agencies, military organizations, research institutions, corporate leadership all infiltrated by enhanced subjects working towards species-wide transformation. Elena's federal background allowed her to understand the implications. Immediately, a coordinated takeover. Enhanced subjects replacing normal humans in positions of authority and influence. Evolutionary advancement requires systematic implementation, the being replied. Random individual enhancement lacks the coordination necessary for species-wide transformation. The program requires centralized control and strategic deployment. Mason felt his enhanced consciousness recoiling from the coldly logical approach to human evolution that the beings advocated. Their methodology eliminated individual choice, cultural diversity, and evolutionary randomness in favor of directed species. Modification controlled by interdimensional entities whose motivations remained unclear. What happens to enhanced subjects who disagree with the program's direction? Mason asked. Disagreement indicates incomplete psychological modification, Garrison answered. Enhanced subjects who retain individual preferences over species advancement require additional conditioning or elimination. The casual mention of eliminating non-compliant enhanced subjects crystallized Mason's understanding of what he was truly facing. The enhancement program wasn't offering evolutionary advancement. It was proposing species-wide subjugation to interdimensional beings, whose concept of human evolution might be fundamentally incompatible with human values. Sarah was examining the enhancement equipment with her scientific background, noting details that might be relevant to developing countermeasures. The dimensional bridging technology requires precise calibration, she observed. Small disruptions might cause system-wide failures. The equipment is protected by multiple redundancy systems, the being noted. But your observation is accurate. Dimensional bridging technology operates within narrow tolerance parameters. Elena had been quietly retrieving items from her equipment pack, assembling what appeared to be communication gear disguised as research instruments. Federal backup is approximately 40 minutes away, she whispered to Doc Henderson. But they don't have equipment capable of dealing with interdimensional technology. Mason's enhanced senses detected movement throughout the complex as security. Protocols activated. Enhanced subjects were sealing exit routes. implementing containment procedures designed to prevent any possibility of escape or outside interference. But his enhanced consciousness was also detecting something else structural. Instabilities in the tunnel system that suggested the mine complex was more fragile than it appeared. Decades of excavation and modification had created load-bearing weaknesses that could be exploited under the right circumstances. The dimensional bridging requires stable spatial coordinates, Mason realized. Geological instability would disrupt the interdimensional connection. Doc Henderson was studying architectural plans displayed on one of the laboratory computers, his medical background allowing him to recognize structural stress patterns. The tunnel system is extending beyond safe load limits. Significant structural failure could collapse the entire complex. The interdimensional beings were beginning the final enhancement procedures, configuring equipment that would permanently transform Mason's biology while simultaneously preparing Sarah and Elena for their own modifications. But Mason's enhanced tactical awareness was identifying a narrow window of opportunity that could disrupt the entire operation. His father's .45 Colt revolver remained in his truck on the surface, but Mason's enhanced memory was recalling details about the weapon that might be relevant to their current situation. The gun represented more than family heritage. It symbolized human choice, individual agency, and the right to resist imposed transformation. "I need to retrieve something from the surface," Mason said, his enhanced consciousness formulating a plan that incorporated multiple tactical elements simultaneously. "Surface access is now restricted," Garrison replied. "The enhancement procedures cannot be interrupted without risking subject mortality." But Mason's enhanced physical capabilities were approaching superhuman levels, and his understanding of the complex's structural vulnerabilities was suggesting possibilities that none of the enhanced subjects or interdimensional beings had considered. The choice he faced wasn't just personal anymore. It was determining the future relationship between human evolution and interdimensional intervention. Mason could accept the enhancement and become part of a coordinated species transformation, resist and likely die in the process, or attempt something unprecedented that might preserve human autonomy while still achieving evolutionary advancement. As the enhancement equipment reached final calibration, Mason realized that the window for action was closing rapidly. Whatever he decided to do would have to happen in the next few minutes, before the interdimensional beings completed their preparations for irreversible human transformation. The question was whether his enhanced capabilities were sufficient to challenge beings whose technological sophistication transcended normal human understanding, and whether the risk of total failure was acceptable when measured against the certainty of species-wide subjugation standing in the underground laboratory that represented over a century of secret research. Mason prepared to make a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the evolutionary future of human civilization itself. Mason's enhanced consciousness synthesized a plan that operated on multiple levels simultaneously: tactical, psychological, and dimensional. His superhuman capabilities were approaching their full potential, but more importantly, his maintained emotional connections were providing psychological stability that no previous enhanced subject had achieved. "Sarah," he said quietly, his enhanced hearing allowing him to communicate at frequencies the interdimensional beings couldn't easily monitor. "The antidote formula you've been working on, could it be modified to disrupt the enhancement process rather than reverse it?" Sarah's scientific background allowed her to understand the implication immediately. Rather than attempting to restore normal human biology, they could potentially create a counteragent that stabilized enhancement at an intermediate level, preserving enhanced capabilities while preventing the psychological modification that eliminated human empathy and social bonding. "Theoretically possible," she whispered back. "But I'd need access to the original venom samples and laboratory equipment to synthesize the compounds." Mason's enhanced senses detected the location of Sarah's confiscated research materials in a storage area one level above their current position. But reaching that equipment would require getting past the enhanced tactical team and potentially confronting the interdimensional beings directly. Elena, Mason continued his quiet communication. How much structural damage would be required to disrupt the dimensional bridging equipment? Elena's federal training had included demolitions work, and her examination of the complex's architecture had revealed critical load-bearing points throughout the tunnel system. Collapse the main support columns, and the entire complex becomes unstable. But that would trap us underground with no possibility of escape. Doc Henderson was monitoring the enhancement preparation procedures, noting details that might be relevant to timing their intervention. The final transformation requires approximately 30 minutes of uninterrupted processing. Disruption during that window could reverse the enhancement entirely. Mason's enhanced tactical awareness was calculating probability matrices that incorporated dozens of variable structural failure timing, enhanced subject response patterns, dimensional technology vulnerabilities, and the likelihood of surviving long enough to implement their countermeasures. But his enhanced consciousness was also processing emotional data that pure tactical analysis couldn't account for. His attachment to Sarah, his protective instincts toward his companions, his determination to preserve human autonomy. These emotional factors were actually enhancing his analytical capabilities, rather than interfering with them. The psychological conditioning protocols are flawed, Mason announced to the interdimensional beings, his enhanced intellect allowing him to communicate at their level of scientific sophistication. Enhanced subjects with maintained emotional connections demonstrate superior performance in complex problem-solving scenarios. The lead being paused in its calibration procedures, regarding Mason with increased attention. Elaborate on your psychological conditioning analysis. Mason's enhanced consciousness was processing multiple streams of information simultaneously, the being's technological vulnerabilities, his companion's capabilities, and the structural weaknesses throughout the complex. But he was also drawing upon emotional intelligence that the interdimensional being's evolutionary path had eliminated from their understanding. Enhanced subjects who retain social bonds demonstrate improved creativity, adaptive problem-solving, and long-term strategic thinking, Mason explained. Emotional connections provide psychological stability that pure logical enhancement cannot achieve. As he spoke, Mason was subtly positioning himself closer to the equipment storage area where Sarah's research materials were being held. His enhanced physical capabilities allowed him to move with fluid grace that appeared casual, but was actually calculated tactical positioning. Your hypothesis lacks empirical support, Garrison interjected. Historical data demonstrates that emotional attachments interfere with optimal enhanced subject performance. Historical data is flawed, Mason replied, his enhanced analytical capabilities identifying patterns in the research that even the interdimensional beings hadn't recognized. Enhanced subjects without emotional anchoring eventually develop psychological instabilities that limit their effectiveness. The program's long-term success rate is actually declining because psychological isolation creates purposeless subjects. Sarah was following Mason's tactical positioning, her scientific equipment within reach if they could create sufficient distraction. Elena had identified potential structural weaknesses in the laboratory's support systems, noting points where small explosions could create cascading failures throughout the complex. The interdimensional beings exchanged rapid communication in frequencies that Mason's enhanced hearing could detect but not fully interpret. Their discussion seemed to focus on evaluating his psychological conditioning hypothesis against their established enhancement protocols. Experimental verification would require group enhancement procedures with maintained emotional bonding. The lead being finally responded. The complexity and failure risk exceed acceptable parameters. Unless the subjects volunteer for experimental enhancement with full understanding of the risks, Mason proposed, his enhanced consciousness formulating a strategy that could simultaneously protect his companions and disrupt the interdimensional being's plans. Mason moved with superhuman speed, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to reach the equipment storage area before the tactical team could respond. But instead of retrieving Sarah's research materials, he grabbed the original venom samples that contained the most concentrated enhancement compounds. Enhanced subjects with emotional bonds might be more valuable than isolated subjects, Mason announced, holding the venom samples in a way that suggested he was prepared to destroy them if necessary, but only if the enhancement preserves rather than eliminates human psychological structures. The interdimensional beings regarded him with what appeared to be genuine scientific curiosity rather than immediate hostility. You propose risking total failure of enhancement procedures to test unproven psychological theories. I propose risking everything to preserve what makes enhancement worthwhile in the first place, Mason replied, his enhanced consciousness integrating logical analysis with emotional conviction in ways that transcended pure rational decision-making. Sarah was preparing her portable laboratory equipment, ready to begin synthesizing counteragents if Mason could provide sufficient time and distraction. Elena had positioned herself near structural support points, ready to implement demolition procedures that would destabilize the entire complex if their situation became desperate. Doc Henderson was monitoring the enhancement preparation equipment, noting critical timing windows when disruption would be most effective. The dimensional bridging requires continuous calibration, he observed. Interruption during the calibration phase would disrupt the entire enhancement process. Mason's enhanced senses detected increasing tension throughout the complex as enhanced subjects prepared for potential conflict. But his emotional intelligence was also recognizing something that pure tactical analysis might have missed. The interdimensional beings were genuinely interested in his psychological enhancement hypothesis. Propose specific experimental protocols, the lid being demanded. Define measurable parameters for evaluating enhanced subjects with maintained emotional bonds. Mason realized he had gained something unprecedented, the opportunity to negotiate the terms of human enhancement rather than simply accepting or rejecting predetermined protocols. His enhanced capabilities combined with preserved emotional intelligence had created possibilities that no previous subject had been able to achieve. The question was whether he could leverage this opportunity to protect human autonomy while still accessing the evolutionary advantages that enhancement offered, or whether the interdimensional beings' interest was simply another form of experimental manipulation designed to achieve their original objectives through alternative methods. The negotiation with the interdimensional beings reached a critical juncture when Mason made a decision that transcended pure tactical calculation. Rather than destroying the venom samples or attempting to escape, he chose to demonstrate the validity of his psychological enhancement theory through direct action. Group enhancement with maintained emotional bonds, Mason announced, preparing to inject himself with concentrated venom while maintaining eye contact with Sarah. Enhanced capabilities without loss of human empathy and social connection. Sarah understood immediately what Mason was proposing: a synchronized enhancement process that would either prove his theory about emotional anchoring or result in their mutual destruction. The risk factors are enormous, she said, her scientific training warring with her emotional attachment to Mason. The potential benefits are unprecedented, Mason replied, his enhanced consciousness processing probability matrices that incorporated variables no previous research had considered. Enhanced subjects who retain human psychological structures could bridge the gap between normal human civilization and interdimensional contact. Elena stepped forward with federal authority that transcended the otherworldly context of their Situation. And if the experiment fails, you eliminate the primary witnesses to this research program. If the experiment succeeds, the lid interdimensional being interjected, we achieve breakthrough understanding of enhanced psychology that could revolutionize cross-dimensional cooperation. The tactical team was positioning for immediate intervention if Mason's group attempted to disrupt the research. But the interdimensional beings signaled for them to maintain observation positions rather than taking aggressive action. Doc Henderson was monitoring the enhancement equipment with medical precision, noting that the synchronized procedures Mason was proposing would require timing accuracy measured in seconds rather than minutes. The margin for error is essentially zero, he warned. Slight variations in enhancement timing could result in psychological incompatibility between enhanced subjects. Mason began preparing the injection procedure, his enhanced dexterity allowing him to manipulate the equipment with superhuman precision. But his enhanced emotional intelligence was also processing the full implications of what he was proposing: permanent transformation that would fundamentally alter his relationship with human civilization. "Sarah," he said quietly, his enhanced hearing allowing him to communicate at frequencies that provided relative privacy. "The antidote you've been developing, could it be modified to create partial reversal if the enhancement goes wrong?" Sarah's scientific background allowed her to formulate responses faster than normal human cognitive processing. Partial reversal might be possible within the first hour of enhancement completion, but the window is narrow, and the process would be extremely dangerous. The interdimensional beings had begun reconfiguring their equipment to accommodate synchronized enhancement procedures. Their movements efficient, but also revealing genuine scientific curiosity about the experimental outcomes. Synchronized enhancement with emotional anchoring has never been attempted across dimensional boundaries. The lead being acknowledged. Mason's enhanced consciousness was simultaneously processing tactical considerations, emotional connections, and dimensional physics, concepts that his normal intellect couldn't have comprehended. The synthesis revealed possibilities that transcended the binary choice between individual enhancement and resistance. Enhanced subjects with maintained human psychology could serve as interpreters between normal human civilization and interdimensional contact, Mason proposed, bridging communication gaps that pure logical enhancement cannot address. Elena was studying the interdimensional beings technology with federal analytical training, noting vulnerabilities that might be exploitable if the enhancement experiment failed. Their equipment operates on principles that require stable dimensional coordinates. Structural collapse could disrupt the interdimensional connection entirely. As Mason prepared for the final injection, he felt a moment of clarity that integrated all of his enhanced capabilities with his preserved emotional intelligence. The choice he was making wasn't just about his own transformation. It was about creating a new category of enhanced being that could preserve human values while accessing superhuman capabilities. "Doc," Mason said, his enhanced tactical awareness processing multiple threat scenarios simultaneously. "If this goes wrong, you and Elena need to implement the structural collapse protocols. Don't let them continue the research with normal human subjects." Doc Henderson nodded grimly, understanding that Mason was asking him to potentially destroy the entire complex and everyone in it, rather than allow the interdimensional beings to proceed with species-wide enhancement under their original protocols. The enhancement injection felt different from Mason's initial snake bite, concentrated, purposeful, and somehow aware of his intentions to maintain emotional connections throughout the transformation process. His enhanced consciousness began processing changes that operated on cellular, psychological, and dimensional levels simultaneously. Sarah administered her own injection with scientific precision, her enhanced pattern recognition allowing her to calibrate the enhancement dose based on Mason's neurological responses. The synchronized transformation created feedback loops between their consciousness that neither had anticipated. The interdimensional beings monitored the procedure with scientific fascination, documenting changes that challenged their understanding of enhanced psychology. Emotional anchoring is maintaining psychological stability throughout accelerated transformation. They observed, but Mason's enhanced senses were detecting structural instabilities throughout the complex as the dimensional bridging equipment operated beyond normal parameters. The synchronized enhancement was creating energetic resonances that the facility's engineering hadn't been designed to accommodate. The underground laboratory began experiencing tremors that suggested imminent structural failure, while Mason and Sarah's transformation reached critical phases that would determine whether their experimental approach to enhancement would succeed or result in catastrophic failure for everyone involved. 3 months after the Clearwater mine complex collapsed in what official reports described as a long overdue geological failure, Mason stood before a simple wooden sign that read, Dyer Ranchest, 1952. The new marker represented more than family heritage. It symbolized his conscious choice to build rather than destroy, to preserve human values while embracing enhanced capabilities. The enhancement had worked, though not in ways that anyone could have predicted. Mason and Sarah had achieved superhuman physical and mental capabilities while maintaining their emotional connections and moral reasoning. But the price had been the complete destruction of the interdimensional research program and the loss of contact with the beings who had provided the original enhancement technology. Elena Vasquez, whose federal credentials had proven genuine, despite her undercover assignment, submitted reports that classified the Clearwater incident as a mining accident, while simultaneously initiating investigations into 17 similar research facilities across the Southwest. Her enhanced capabilities, acquired through partial exposure during the mine collapse, made her uniquely qualified to identify and shut down the remaining Blackwood operations. The enhanced subjects from other facilities have been remarkably cooperative, Elena reported during one of her visits to the ranch. Without the interdimensional beings' coordination, most of them seemed genuinely confused about their purpose and objectives. Doc Henderson had retired from active medical practice, but he continued monitoring Mason and Sarah's condition with scientific fascination and medical concern. Your cellular regeneration rates have stabilized at levels that suggest lifespans measured in centuries rather than decades, he observed. But unlike previous enhanced subjects, you've retained normal human emotional responses and social behaviors. The psychological integration had been the most challenging aspect of their transformation. Enhanced cognitive capabilities combined with superhuman physical abilities created constant temptation to view normal humans as inferior or irrelevant. But their maintained emotional connections provided psychological anchoring that prevented the detachment and superiority complex that had characterized previous enhanced subjects. Sarah had returned to Arizona State University, but her research now focused on developing ethical guidelines for human enhancement rather than advancing enhancement technology itself. We have capabilities that could revolutionize human civilization, she told Mason during one of her frequent visits to the ranch. But we also have the responsibility to ensure that enhancement serves humanity rather than replacing it. The romantic relationship that had developed between Mason and Sarah during their shared ordeal had deepened into something that transcended normal human bonding. Their enhanced capabilities created communication possibilities that operated on multiple levels, simultaneously emotional, intellectual, and somehow dimensional in ways that neither fully understood. Enhanced subjects with emotional anchoring represent a new category of human evolution, Sarah explained during a quiet evening on the ranch house porch. We're no longer entirely human, but we haven't lost our humanity either. Old Pete had vanished during the mine collapse. His century-plus existence apparently ended when the dimensional bridging equipment was destroyed. Mason felt genuine grief for the loss, despite understanding that Pete's loyalty had been directed toward the enhancement program rather than the Dyer family. He was trapped by circumstances beyond his control, Mason reflected. Enhanced subjects, without emotional anchoring, become prisoners of their modifications. Pete never had the opportunity to choose his own path. The ranch had become a refuge for the small number of enhanced subjects who had retained psychological stability after the interdimensional program's collapse. They formed an informal community dedicated to developing ethical applications of their capabilities while maintaining connections to normal human civilization. Federal oversight of their activities was minimal but constant, with Elena serving as liaison between the enhanced community and government agencies that were still trying to understand the implications of human enhancement technology. Enhanced subjects who pose no threat to normal humans are being monitored but not restricted, Elena explained. Though that policy could change if enhancement technology becomes more widely available. Mason's daily routine had adapted to accommodate his enhanced capabilities while preserving the essential character of ranch life. He could complete physical tasks that would have required hours and minutes, but he chose to work at normal human pace to maintain psychological connection to his family's legacy. The cattle seemed to recognize his enhanced status, responding to his presence with unusual calm and cooperation. His enhanced senses allowed him to monitor the health and behavior of the entire herd simultaneously, but he continued using traditional ranching methods that honored his grandfather's and father's approaches to livestock management. Enhanced capabilities are tools, Mason had concluded after months of adaptation. They don't change who you choose to be. They just expand the range of what you can accomplish. The destroyed mine site had been sealed by federal agencies and designated as geologically unstable, preventing casual exploration, while allowing scientific teams to study the dimensional physics principles that had made interdimensional contact possible. But Mason's enhanced senses could detect subtle energetic signatures that suggested the dimensional barrier remained weakened rather than completely restored. There's still something down there, Sarah confirmed during one of their visits to the sealed site. Enhanced subjects can perceive dimensional fluctuations that normal humans can't detect. The interdimensional contact might be severed, but the possibility of re-establishing it remains. As autumn settled across the Arizona desert, Mason found himself teaching his nephew Jake about desert safety and ranching responsibilities. The 8-year-old boy listened with the serious attention that country children learn early, understanding that knowledge about the land could mean the difference between safety and danger. Grandpa always said that the desert teaches you everything you need to know, Mason explained as they checked water levels at the stock tanks. You just have to pay attention and respect what it's telling you. Jake nodded solemnly, unaware that his uncle possessed capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. Mason had chosen to preserve the appearance of normal life, using his enhanced abilities subtly and privately rather than creating fear or disrupting established social relationships. Will I run the ranch someday, Uncle Mason? Jake asked with the directness that children bring to important questions. Mason considered the question carefully, his enhanced consciousness processing implications that stretched far beyond simple family succession. If you choose to, he replied, but that choice will be yours to make when you're ready to understand what it really means. The ranch represented continuity, connection to family heritage, commitment to the land, and preservation of values that transcended technological or biological advancement. Mason had gained superhuman capabilities, but he'd chosen to use them in service of fundamentally human purposes. As the sun set over the desert landscape that had shaped 4 generations of his family, Mason reflected on the journey that had transformed him from a simple cowboy into something beyond normal human categories, while preserving the essential elements of his identity. The enhancement had given him power, But wisdom had taught him that true strength came from choosing how to use that power in service of values larger than himself. The ranch would endure. The desert would continue teaching its lessons. And the next generation would face their own choices about what it meant to be human in a world where the boundaries of human possibility were constantly expanding. The snake that had bitten him months earlier had carried venom from the past. But Mason was building something entirely new, a future where enhanced capabilities served human values rather than replacing them, where progress meant becoming more human rather than less. Standing before the simple ranch sign as night settled across the Arizona desert, Mason knew he had found his answer to the question that enhancement had posed. Power without purpose corrupts, but power in service of love, family, and community becomes the foundation for a better world.